when I was in Israel, actually, some pretty wild things happened to me that made me realize that my dream of transition could actually come true somewhere. After the institute was over, and I'd gone to this institute with a girlfriend of mine at the time, we extended our trip and ended up in the West Bank. And one night we stayed in a refugee camp in Bethlehem, and the next night we stayed in a Palestinian multimillionaire's house, which he had rented out as an Airbnb. So about as, opposing backgrounds as you possibly could find, the poorest and the richest. And so I found myself, in the West Bank, and in between the transit to these two cities, my girlfriend and I got off at the wrong stop in a shared taxi, meaning that we were entirely in the wrong city. So in about 2018 or 2019, Google Maps in the West Bank had not been launched. So it was very old school, old fashioned. You had to actually ask people how to get to the place you wanted to get to. So my girlfriend and I were wandering around the West Bank with our massive suitcases, and we had stumbled into this coffee shop. And the owner of the coffee shop greets us. He can tell we're tourists immediately because of the size of our suitcases. He welcomes us in. He gives us free hot dog, free coffee. We start talking. And as I'm talking to him, I notice that the only people around us are all men. And this didn't surprise me because I'd been studying Arabic since I was 12. And I know that most Arab cities are sex, I guess the major institutions or places, like public life in general, is very sex segregated in the Middle East. It's a very homosocial culture. And I'd already known that there are some cafes that men go to and other cafes that women go to. And so we had ended up in this cafe, and around us were all men. And so I didn't know what to make of that. But of course, it's pretty obvious to anybody that tourists get away with things that locals don't. So I ended up in this cafe. I was talking to the coffee shop owner, and I told him at some point that I spoke a little Arabic, and we switched to Arabic. And he, when he started talking to me, he referred to me in the masculine. And that's the moment in which I realized that while in the United States, I would get perceived as a masculine woman, which is not what I wanted to be. In the Middle East, I can do the same exact thing. And because they don't know what a lesbian is outside of Tel Aviv, I can get away with it. And so there was that moment. And then my girlfriend and I, after our trip to the West Bank, had gone back to Jerusalem. We found ourselves at the Western Wall, which is sex segregated. And because I had already gotten the impression that people perceive me as a man, and because that was how I wanted to be perceived, I just waltzed onto the men's side of the Western Wall with a kippah in my pocket, put it on my head, just waltzed in. And I was greeted by this 18-year-old kid from New York who he looks at me and he says, "Excuse me, sir, are you Jewish?" And I told him I was. And he said, "Are you above the age of 13? And I thought, ouch, because I was 19. But I told him that I was. And he asked me if I had wrapped tefillin that day. And tefillin is, for those who don't know, they're these ritual straps that Jewish men from 13 years and older are required to wear for their prayers. These black straps that you wrap around the arm and one on the head. So he'd asked me if I'd engaged in this ritual before, and I told him that I hadn't. And he gets really excited. He walks me through the ritual. I say the prayers. And he looks at me and he asks me, "So you've never done this, not even at your bar mitzvah?" And I told him, "Well, no, I've never had a bar mitzvah." So next thing I know, this guy is yelling to his friends in Yiddish. And within a moment, I'm holding hands with like 5 or 6 ultra-Orthodox Jewish guys prancing around in a circle, singing songs, dancing around. And then we hear a siren. It's a Shabbat siren, letting everybody know that the Sabbath is starting soon and that everybody needs to start wrapping things up so you can get back to your family and welcome in the Sabbath. And because phones are prohibited on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, he asks me for my smartphone. I open it. It's clear that he wants to take a picture, but he doesn't know how. I have to teach him to press on the white circular button in order to take a picture, because this kid has clearly never used a smartphone in his life. And he tells me to stand in front of the wall. And I ask him, well, where would you like me to stand? And he says, well, where would you like me to take your bar mitzvah photo? So that's the moment in which I realized that, I had a bar mitzvah that I didn't know happened until it was over. And I think that was a moment that really solidified both my Jewish identity as a post-Soviet Jew and my male identity. And that's the moment in which I realized, okay, my parents want me to study abroad, and I think I've just found the place. While they were trying to get me out of trans, I found my perfect way in. And so I decided to study abroad in Israel. And while everybody at the university knew me as a woman, because that's what was listed on my documents, in my private life, I had a very rich social life as a man. And once my studies were up and Corona happened, I realized that I wanted to stay in Israel because I fell in love with the country, and I got to speak 4 languages every day. It was like a perfectly stimulating environment. It's exactly what I needed. English, Russian, Arabic, and Hebrew. So I got to speak 4 languages every day. I was living my best life. And once my university studies were over, everybody in my life knew me as a man. I ended up being illegal in Israel for several years because the bureaucracy didn't know how to handle my case. They didn't know whether to treat me as an American or as somebody who came from the former Soviet Union. So they bounced me between like 5 different agencies because Israeli bureaucracy is hellish. And in those 3 or so years, I was illegal. I couldn't leave the country. I didn't have any access to healthcare. And in that time, I lived through a few wars, and I'd had a lot of crazy experiences. I worked, under the table jobs, mostly cleaning and catering with the ultra Orthodox Jewish community. And I lived my life there as a man, totally. And so by day, I was cosplaying as an Orthodox Jewish man. And by night, I was hanging out in Jerusalem and the West Bank with Arabs. So I kind of had one foot in each community, and I lived my life as a man in both of those communities. And very few people in my life knew that I was actually female.